Lord, thank you so very much for the beauty of this day and the goodness of your love. Pray that you would visit us this morning. Amen. Amen. Well, good morning, everybody. This morning we are talking about learning discernment from a trout. So you might want to grab a pen and a journal or a piece of paper. We're going to use that later. So if you've spent a lot of time in the Bible or around church, there's a good chance that you know Romans 12:2a almost by heart, right? Do not be conformed to this world, ... but what? Be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Does that sound familiar to y'all? It's a familiar verse to us. A lot of us have that one in our brain. But you know what comes right after in Romans 12:2b? For most of us, that gets a little more fuzzy. But it's actually the main point of the verse. So in this passage, St. Paul is telling us just to do two things. One, don't be conformed to this world, and rather, two, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Okay, why? Why shouldn't we be conformed to this world? And why should we be transformed? What's the point of this admonition? Well, if you look at it carefully, the answer is found in one word, and that is discernment. Discernment. So Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect, right? The point of being transformed by the renewal of our mind is so that we can discern God's will. That is, so that we can hear God's voice in a given situation or just in our day-to-day lives. And if this is the point of being transformed by the renewal of our mind, and it is, it would seem that this ability to discern matters. And it does. So what is discernment? Ruth Haley Barton writes, discernment in the most general sense is the capacity to recognize and respond to the presence and activity of God, both in the ordinary moments and in the larger decisions of our lives. Discernment literally means to separate, to discriminate, to determine, to decide, or to distinguish between two things. Spiritual discernment is the ability to distinguish or discriminate between good, that which is of God and draws us closer to God, and evil, that which is not of God and draws us away from God. So discernment, the ability to hear God's voice and know God's will, is a crucial ability and a beautiful invitation for followers of Jesus. It's how we move from simply making decisions based on a variety of factors to listening to God so that we can respond to whatever God is saying. And so it's tragic and it's unnecessary for a Christian to be unable to distinguish God's voice from other voices, or who can't, with some degree of confidence, identify what God is saying when he's saying something. Discernment is also a beautiful invitation for followers of Jesus. An increased capacity for discernment is where greater intimacy with God leads, because the more experiences of hearing God's voice we have, we can become more familiar with what God's voice sounds like to each one of us, and we can more easily hear him. I've long loved this insight from Oswald Chambers. He says, get into the habit of saying, speak, Lord, and life will become a romance. Every time circumstances press in on you, say, speak, Lord, and make time to listen. As we listen, our ears become more sensitive, and like Jesus, we will hear God all the time. What an invitation. And yet, for all of its importance and its promise, discernment and hearing God remains a confusing and even intimidating topic for many of us. As Christians, we believe that God still speaks, but for many of us, the question remains, does God really speak to me? And in ways that I can actually know that it's him. And so with all the other loud voices that surround me, how do I distinguish God's still small voice? So I want to be able to hear God better. And I bet you do too. And for my part, I want to discern like a trout. This is a big, beautiful rainbow trout. Isn't that a gorgeous fish? So trout, be they rainbow trout or browns or brookies or cutthroat, they have an incredible ability to discern, to distinguish between that which is real and that which isn't. And they have to for their survival. Just admiring the beauty of God's creation right there. So we can go ahead and take that down, Drew. 95% of the time, a trout feeds in the river by pointing its nose upstream in the water, staying in one place and watching for what the current washes past them. They're constantly observing what's in the flow, watching for insects like mayflies or caddisflies or stoneflies in their pupal and larval stages as those bugs float down the river on their way to floating to the top so they can emerge into adults, right? So the fish watch the flow for a stray worm or a sow bug or a scud or something else that gets washed into the water, maybe a little freshwater shrimp. They're just watching the flow of the water, watching for anything that looks edible. And when they see something that they think is food, they go for it, right? So it's just waiting. It sees something and it goes for it, right? And it goes for it. So imagine that a stream is like a giant conveyor belt with a constant supply of food that the trout selects from, ignoring what doesn't look like food, ignoring what doesn't look like something to eat. It's like a huge, constantly moving buffet coming at the fish, and it has to decide what is food and what is junk. And for this, the trout has to have incredible eyesight, and it does. Because the challenge for the fish is that these food sources on the liquid conveyor belt are incredibly small, incredibly small. So that big trout that I just showed you, right? It feeds on something that's that size. See how small those are? Those are the size of flies. Those are the size of fake little bugs that the trout will eat. They're incredibly tiny, right? I can't even, it's hard for me to even tell you how small they are, right? But the reason I put them on a cork is because if I held it in my finger, you wouldn't even be able to see it. That's what the trout are feeding on. That's what they're looking for in that conveyor belt. And often the water moves really fast. And there's always stuff in the water that isn't food, like bits of grass and dirt, twigs, aquatic vegetation, and often bits of microtrash. So while there's lots of bugs in the water, there's also a lot of debris that has no nutrient value whatsoever. So let's just take a minute and see what a trout sees while it is watching for food in the water column. So that's a lot of debris, right? And the problem for the fish is that it has to calculate how much energy will be expended to move the required distance in order to grab a morsel, and whether or not that morsel has enough calories in it to justify the effort to take it. So if a trout moves too far and burns a lot of energy to get a small bite that doesn't have enough calories in it, well, if the trout makes that mistake too many times, it'll starve. So very quickly, the trout learn to be very discriminating, very discerning. And they notice what food is actually in the water at a given time, what bugs are at what stage and are hatching when. And that's when that's what they watch for. That's what they key in on. And so trout are famously picky, which makes them so challenging to catch, right? Famously difficult to catch. So a trout's brain is only the size of a pea. And that little computer is constantly making that calories versus energy calculation. The fish is discerning between what is food and what is not food, and it gets very good at being able to distinguish between the two. And so most of what's in the water is not edible, which means the fish sees it and it lets it pass right on by. And then when it sees food, it snatches it. It has learned to distinguish. It has learned to discern. And so sometimes something passes by the trout that has been made to closely resemble what aquatic creature it might be eating at that given time, hoping to fool the fish into thinking it's real, hoping to induce a bite. And in that case, that bite can end up being caught. So bits and fur, feather, and thread have been glued to a small hook to make it look like a bug in the water, right? To fool the trout. And this is where fly fishing comes in. And we're not going to go into fly fishing this morning, more on that later in the week. On Friday, I'm putting out a soundings post, which has some of these comments, but also talks a little bit more about fly fishing and what happens when the trout gets something and it gets caught and how that relates to us and God and all that sort of thing. So Friday, you'll see that. Today, though, to bring it back to spiritual discernment, the trout gives us a great example of what discernment is. So like a lot of debris floating in the stream, there is so much noise that surrounds us constantly. Amen. Right? There's social media, media in general, family dynamics, work demands and stress, advertisements, 24-hour news coverage, music of all sorts, anytime on demand, psychological pain that can make noise for us, strained relationships, shouted opinions, so many voices telling us what we should think and feel and look like and what we should do and, of course, what we should buy. Discernment is being able to hear God's voice amidst all those voices. And just like most of what's in the water isn't food for a trout and it rejects it, similarly, most of what we hear around us isn't God. And so the task is to identify which is God's voice and to respond to that. And this is something that we can learn. So discernment is such a critical capacity for a Christian and such a beautiful invitation that we're actually, throughout the course of this year, we're going to be getting at discernment from various angles. And you'll see later in the chat on January 27th, we have our spiritual directors who are going to be talking to us about what's discernment? What is this thing? But for now and this morning, one place to start as we ponder discernment is to simply reflect on times in the past when you did hear God's voice, or when we did know God's will in a given situation, right? To call that to mind and to really reflect on it, to take that experience apart and identify characteristics within that experience. How did I come to know that this was in fact God's voice to me? And so that's what we're going to do for the next 10 minutes or so. We're going to hear the lovely sound of water rushing through a river, and then we have a couple of questions for us to consider, a little bit of guidance here. So call to mind God's loving presence with you right now, that God is delighting in you this very moment, and you might want to offer a prayer of thanks. And then take a minute or two to remember a time or times when God spoke to you and you knew it was God at the time, or you would come to know that it was God in retrospect. Write down that experience or write them down, and then choose one and remember what that was like and how it came to be and what happened, what helped you to know that it was God. Let's do this for the next 10 minutes or so. take another couple of moments to wrap up. Lord, thank you that you are attentive to us. Thank you that you see, and thank you that you speak. Amen. Amen. So if you were able to list even just one time, some of you might have listed once, others of you might have listed a number of times, but if you are able to list even just one time, good news, you have the capacity to hear God. Yes, you. And so the first foundation of the Christian principle of discernment is very simple: that God speaks and that we can hear him.